Okay, guys, welcome back to Bisrat Apologetics. We're very excited today to be hosting Dr. Mdingi, who is based in the University of Pretoria, where he lectures on systematic theology there. But he's also an activist, a political activist. He's somebody who is a champion of Black liberation. And so we're living in a time where everything that is Christian is being questioned. And a lot of the times, you'll hear the Christian narrative being associated with things like oppression or, colonialism and so on. And so today we are going to hear a different perspective. We're going to hear about the role of the church in Black liberation. And so, welcome to you, Dr. Mdingi. And won't you please just share a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what you're currently doing at the moment?
All right, no, thanks a lot, my brother. As introduced, my name is Hlulani Simelelo Mdingi, born in Soweto, Jablani. Grew up there for the most part of my life. Went to primary school, and later on to high school, Johannesburg CBD, Yeovil to be specific. Um, didn't really have a career path. I wanted to be anything except, a working man.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that one for me was very important because I sort of understood that even if one does get involved in work, it's often for the same monetary reasons that many of us are involved in the hustle and bustle of life. Subsequent to that, just chose a very dizzy course. I won't call the name of the institution, but it's a good institution. So yeah, I went there. I did a year. After a year, I dropped out, and I think part of my dropping out is because I was also coming to a state of consciousness, political consciousness, to be quite honest, which just would not allow me to continue doing things as I was doing them before. I think my major issue is that I refused to be taught by white people, so that's why I actually dropped out of the course. So yeah, um, so in between, I then got involved in a process of what we called then self-education, where you can imagine the trauma you bring to your parents. You don't want to go to school, but here they find you reading every day, and they can't make sense of that. you know. Yeah, and of course, grew up in a very BC oriented family. Became quite active from a very young age, but not with the view that you become active purely because your family is active. You need to understand the struggles of the oppressed very clearly and get involved in. So that was that. Subsequent to that, a lot happened, and finally, I went to study theology. Always wrestled with how one becomes political or remains political and Christian because good Christians don't get involved in politics.
Sorry,
So yeah,
before you go a little bit further, I just wanted to know what led you to choose theology, because you went from not attending school and so what made you choose theology as sort of an area of study?
well, what was interesting as well was that with my growing political consciousness or my heightening of my own political consciousness, I also was sort of drawn to what one might call spirituality of some form. I grew up on the main in a Christian home, um, though I stopped going to church because I was around 16, because I just it didn't make sense to me. But I think those values were there and they remained with me for a very long time. And with my search of wanting to understand and being political and so forth, I think I was drawn to theology because I found a space where my spiritual longing was sort of satisfied. And I always thought of that my politics, I could make the separation and be political and spiritual in the church or at home, and be political in the streets or wherever. And I did theology, but I think there was always a struggle in between of how I actually deal with this too, because of course, certainly there's always that fact about the church being spoiled by bureaucracy on the main, Went to Bible school. Bible school was taught by white lecturers, in contrast to my first ideological position of not being wanting to be taught by whites. went there to Bible school, but also I think those things were being reinforced. In my third year, when I was actually finishing my studies, I remember one dean of the college said to me, so he was asking the class around who's going to study and study what. And of course, people were saying, no, I'm going to study this, I'm going to study this. And I said, no, I'm going to study theology at an honors level. And one of the things he told me said, well, 2,000 years of scholarship, what do you
Sure.
think you're going to contribute? You know, can imagine a white racist man asking you that. And on the main, you look at the history of Christian theology dominated by whites. I mean, you know, something I think we'll touch on later. But on the main, I said, okay, fine, let me go and do this. And then at that point, because I sort of glanced over Black liberation theology, I sort of began to be quite interested in it. And I found peace that at least I had a space where my Blackness, my spirituality, and otherwise could be blended in one space, and I could still remain who I wanted to be, all at the same time. So yeah, I went and I did it. Decided to go even further with postgraduate stuff, because I think there is a need for us to make some kind of contribution in society,
Absolutely.
or intellectually and
Yes.
otherwise. But we have to make a clear and decisive calls of the kind of things that we want to do in the first place, because sometimes we might find ourselves just really putting people further deep into the lull that religion
Sure.
sometimes puts people in.
So curiosity has me now personally to say that, what was it that you didn't want not to be taught by a white person? Is it because of the I don't know, the race thing, or what was the reason behind that?
Well, I think I didn't have a problem with it initially when I was in school, né? But
Yeah.
when my height, political consciousness came into being, and I considered how the monumental achievements that Black people have ever achieved in the world.
Okay.
And I was like, I always struggled that at some point we used to teach the world, and suddenly we're being the
Sure.
ones that are being taught. And I think we taught quite differently. And of course, I'm not trying to avoid being an African sensationalist here, but we
Sure.
taught because we thought that knowledge was something that was beneficial for the whole of society.
Yeah.
But on the main, when our enemies teach us, they teach us with the aim to cripple us. And here
Indeed.
one
Yeah.
of the words of George Jackson, who says, Mother, I thank you for everything. I thank you for food. I thank you for shelter. I thank you for everything. The only thing I have against you is that you forced me to go to those schools, and you forgot that those who teach us are the enemy of your own race. Sometimes, I mean, we look at it quite
Deep.
deeply and say, look, our children, we've got more than 70% of young Black children are not employed
Yeah.
in this country. I think so much, yes, you've got a problem that, well, there aren't those jobs that exist because of the kind of socio-economic framework we find ourselves in. But more importantly,
Yeah.
they are not being taught to deal with the bareness of life and the hardships of life and the
Sure.
creative impulse to try and go against the grain. We're teaching them to get qualifications,
Yeah.
to be credentialized, but on the main, we violate the basic premise that Sasso, I think, taught us quite well, that education is the accumulation of knowledge. One, two, accumulation of knowledge that may or may not be used in the world. So sometimes you might have knowledge that may not be useful in the world.
No, actually.
I think, you've pretty much led us into our first question, which I guess it's nice to identify the problem that we're trying to address. And maybe, for some of our viewers, most of them are Christian people, and some of them don't even know, when they're hearing people talking about the church being involved in things like colonialism, things like slavery, oppression, and you also touched on it as well. When some of the missionaries came, of course, they came with the gospel, but there was also an element of saying, I guess my culture, since I'm the one who's teaching, I can sort of impose a little bit of my culture and say there's something wrong with your culture because I'm the one who's bringing the information, the knowledge, the gospel, and so on. That could, be seen as something that sort of erodes people's cultures and kind of demonizes, in a sense, other people's cultures. But, from your perspective, what would you sort of say, I guess, in terms of the history of South Africa, particularly, would be the role of the church in colonization and oppression and those sort of things?
I think the starting point is that we must always define what we mean by church. Um, Sometimes we might be calling things the church when in fact it's not the church. Earlier today, I was talking to one student of mine, in which is a question that I've literally been posting or forcing students to wrestle with. And I said, what is indigenous about Christianity? There should be something that's indigenous in it. And I don't mean indigenous in the fact that we're saying what it's in indigenous like African culture. Or no, no, no. I'm saying something which is basic in its own tenets in how people relate to it and accept it for what it is. And I always tell, and I'm like, look, we've got the first issue is that the Christian faith begins on the premise of a Galilean man who is God in the flesh. And I accept that. I have no problem. I am a follower of Yeshua, and I think he's Lord, his Savior. I do affirm that he will come again. But I took also serious the logic of him being born among the poor. I always make the point that it was not a mistake that the wise men go to Herod's courts and ask, where is he that is king of the Jews? Kings are born in palaces. It makes sense. But yet, when they got there, they found the puppet regime, who was Herod, who was put in place by the Romans to make sure that he manages the majority of the Jews who had been dominated by the Roman occupying force, which is no different than the one that is occupied Azania. However, the Savior had been born in a very dodgy place to show indeed what we have always believed as liberation theologians, that God is on the side of the downtrodden and the oppressed. Even when we talk about our sin, we speak about God being one who comes and delivers us or liberates us from the bondage of sin. So it's very much important that we do so. And even when the church started, it did not start with lofty idealism or lofty principles and doctrines. It began among the poor. Jesus did not fit in the category or the status of the great Davidic king who was going to come and deliver them. He came with a different view, which expressed the logic of a God who has always been interested in the poverty and the oppression of his people. The Jews or the Hebrews did not become God's people because he actually necessarily liked them above everybody else. But there's a logic to the story about a God who says to Moses, have you heard the cries of my people down in Egypt? And a God who is involved in history, a God who just does not leave us unattended to. We take seriously our existential issues. And similarly, when we think about the Lord Jesus Christ, we think in the same vein of a God who did not leave us in that sense. And when he established his church, he established it among the poor, the uneducated, and so forth. So that is the first thing. But then something happens roundabout when Christianity seeks to try and make itself reasonable, I suppose, to the so-called educated class. Of course, through philosophy, through this and that. But then you've got the third phase where Christianity, being a religion that has always been in the fringes and hiding in persecution, becomes associated with the empire. And we know then what happens throughout the ages and ultimately how the church becomes coerced. Now, I would make the distinction that the church that the Lord Christ had established is not the church that is responsible for colonialism. It's the church which we still have to discover for ourselves. The church that is responsible for the trauma in the world is a church that has compromised on the gospel to an extent that the point that you made, how you put the two to be in the same vein, that we are evangelizing and civilizing at the same time. The automatical assumption or the logical end to it is that civilization and the gospel then become synonymous to Western society. And that is the crisis that we're facing as we sit today. So the church needs to sort of go back and reevaluate what it is and who it is, and even the kind of options that it prefers for itself, whether they are aligned to the faith or not. Now, that's where sort of like liberation theology comes in, because there's always been the issue that surely God cannot be happy with what happens in the world. Surely a good God cannot be capable of such atrocities. Surely a good God cannot be responsible for land dispossession, cannot be involved in dehumanization. So clearly there's something that went fundamentally wrong. And when liberation theology, which is also a response based on the material conditions of the people, but also the kind of demands that the gospel wants of us, began to challenge those things and also the status of the church in the broader context of society. So, liberation on the main, whether you want to give it a theological twist, has always been central to the Christian faith. Whether you're looking at Jesus as the savior of human sins or a God who's on the side of the oppressed, so you have in it. The danger is when the church is coerced. The danger is when the church assumes itself to be close to power to an extent that it's not willing to even put the gospel at the center of all its operation. Because the gospel is quite demanding. Every disciple of Christ cannot think that they will pass the buck to somebody else. It is your responsibility and you must take it seriously. So the church, I think, is struggling with the fact that she's failing to define herself. She's failing to separate herself. She's failing to leave Egypt, even for that matter. It's always that thing that better the oppression that we have now than the one that we do not know about. It's like when people say, better the devil that you know than the one you don't know. But the point of the there's the devil, whether you know him or you don't know him. I don't think the devil, you know. So I think that's where you realize that throughout, you look at the history of slavery, you look at the history of colonialism, there is something that also the gospel was able to do for people to resist the kind of oppression, whether it came at times, though few times from whites than it did come from blacks. Even more importantly, if you talk about African spirituality, you have to contend with certain things. I was telling my students just the other day, I said, there's a story that is told about Usopuza, one of the kings of the Swati people, who had a prophecy about the coming of whites. And he made the point that, look, the people are going to come and they're going to come with a black book and coins. But learn a lot from this black book because it's the message Gamlenze Ngamunye, who was the name of God. So I then say to them, it is very interesting that an African prophet who's not necessarily Christian would identify in the much broader sense of African spirituality that this is the message of the God whom they actually have been worshiping. So I don't think there is contradiction. I just think it becomes quite difficult when there's always a cultural imposition or appropriation. That's the one that makes us to have a serious problem. But African spirituality has always been open. And it has always been real. It doesn't take us out of the world in the same way the true gospel does not take us out of the world. It says we must find a way in this world. We must find a way in this mad society. And we must also be willing to take the risks, whatever they take us and whatever they mean to us. So you have a sense that we have to redefine ourselves as the church and also be active in the church to try and resolve the issues of society.
Speaking on that comment of the Xhosa prophet, who does mention that there will be a group of people that will come and we need to take the book, but he spoke on two things. Also, take the book, but something about leave the coin. And it's always been this thing about Africans to say that how is it that Christianity is how is it part of us? How is it that we can trust it? How is it that we can make it part of us in a way? Because I think most of the people are struggling to accept it, whether the prophet did the Xhosa prophet did say it or not. But still, the people are just finding it difficult to adjust to it. They always look at it as if it's a foreign thing. It's a force that is not natural to the Africans, but how is it that Christianity is applicable to the Africans today as we speaking right now?
Well, I think also it's also maybe one thing which I should also add. It's not only the Xhosa prophet Unsigane who said it. You find it among various cultures and so forth. Last year we had a conference with a brother from India, and I told him the story, and he said, in fact, the story is also common among Indian people. So, of course, I don't want to be controversial in the sense that to speak about spirituality, but I think on the broad spectrum of spirituality, not only is saying that Christianity is supreme, but we've always
Sure.
understood the communication of God with his or with the people generally, and maybe it works differently in different times. Now, I would
Sure.
not, I think, and this I share with some of my colleagues, that the biggest thing that I think white society will have to face is that even when it comes to the acceptance of Jesus among blacks, or the rejection of Jesus, it lies primarily on them than it lies on anybody else. Because
Sure.
Akerebona, they've seen what it means to be a Christian. They've seen how much you lose in being a Christian. But for white people, it seems like it's their culture, when in fact it's not even their culture.
It's not,
They
yeah.
just appropriated it, and it works to their advantage. I mean, I had a lecturer at Bible school who kept on insisting that Jesus was closer to the Africans than he is to the Europeans. So I became quite mischievous. I said, "Well, Menir, Jesus is in fact black," and I came up with some dodgy information of mine to prove my point. I remember he
Yeah.
struggled for 2 hours. Every after 10 minutes, he would say, "Come on, are you saying Jesus is black?" And I'm like, "This is the guy who was saying to the two Africans." But he couldn't accept it on the main. It
Yeah.
was nice for him to say so. It's nice for them to say he's not European. It's nice but they will not accept the fact that he's not like them. There's a strong insistence that he must look like them so that they can validate their culture. You think,
Sure.
even so, in the history of the church, when you deal with
Yeah.
heresy, such as apartheid being a heresy, what was the effect for those who tried to mislead God's people? They were expelled, they were excommunicated. But white society is spared because we cried during the TRC, we lit candles, we wore the
Sure.
regalia of the church. But we never dealt with them in the true sense of how a Christian church and Christian theology responds to heresy. To say that people are created in the image of God and directly violate that is a theological problem. And I'll make an
Indeed,
example.
yeah.
In the classroom, you have demographics that are different. You have whites on the other side, and you have
Sure.
black on the other side, and still continues even now in historically white universities. Then you have to ask yourself the question, and I asked the question in one conference. I said, if one is sitting this side and the other is sitting this side, who sits in the middle? And of course, they had to make some kind of argument about who sits in the middle. I said, no, no, no. If I am to be Christian about this or use church language, the devil
Sure.
sits in the middle, you see. Whether you like it or not, he sits in the middle because there are certain arguments that can be made about certain fields. I'm not saying they're valid, but they can be made. But for a Christian church that claims to be Christ, but cannot reconcile what it has done or what it continues to do, it's no longer just a social problem, it's a deep theological problem. In fact, if it's possible, Christians must simply at that point abandon Jesus because they're not willing to carry the cross and the demands that it makes upon us, both white and black. Now, of course, there are questions of justice that come with it. The Bible says, "He that is stolen must steal no more." You cannot keep it up and say, "It's fine. I deserve white, better living standards. I deserve ill-begotten wealth. I deserve." You cannot make that. In the same way, it's not justifiable to say, "No, but Mahua
Exactly.
so it's fine that we should now do it." It does not work that way. So we have to find a way to reconcile this. And I don't think that this new rejection of people rejecting Christianity because I just let's just be fair. Check the story correct. Check the facts
Sure.
correct. It's like saying that using a spoon is Western. It can't be Western. It's development on the main.
Yeah.
But because maybe it is developed within a particular culture, you seem to presuppose that it is therefore white and cannot be anything else. In fact, there's a big joke that is always told that there's a brother who went around saying, "We as blacks, we eat with our hands." And one brother responded and said, "But Vikings too ate with their hands." So what's your argument?
I,
So you have those things that we have to wrestle with, and that is why for the
indeed,
Black
yeah.
Consciousness movement in particular, they knew, and I'll make two examples. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in the United States, a very strong Marxist-Leninist group, which responded also perfectly well to the call of Black Power. Then, similarly, in the same frame or time frame, you had the Black Consciousness movement here in South Africa. Two movements that are almost similar in terms of orientation, self-determination, and so forth. But the difference was that the Black Consciousness movement understood that their people are in the church. So you can organize all you like, but if you leave our people who are in the church, you have not done anything. And same applies with the guys in the US. They lost a lot of people because the movement seemed not to be related to the fact that the large majority of their people were in the church. Later on, Huey P. Newton, the founder, made the point. He said, the biggest mistake we made is that we abandoned the one institution that has developed with us ever since we landed in the United States, which is the Black church. The leaders that we're talking about, your Fred Douglass, your Malcolm X, they all are products of the church. In fact, when Du Bois makes the point, he says that, we have this nameless and invisible institution which expresses the best that we have, and the preacher becomes the idealist, he becomes the boss, he becomes the philosopher, he organizes the slaves. I mean, most slave rebellions came because of the church. And part of the reason was that when they read the Bible from themselves, they did not see a Jesus who said they must suffer, they must be oppressed. They saw a Savior who said, let them engage their enemy, let them do this. So all I'm trying to say, ultimately, these things, I don't think this thing will succeed. This rejection that is quite common. In fact, I always tell some of my friends who are there, I'm like, as long as you don't piss me off 20 years from now and you are more Christian than I am, and you're going to call me that now Islam is very political, because now you've gone through the phase. You've done, she's still in bed, you did everything. Now you think because of whatever reason you want Jesus. Please don't piss me off at that age, because I would have told you. That way things are.
Sure.
If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But don't impose on anybody. I mean, myself, I'm a Christian. I have a lot of Christian or non-Christian friends. I don't impose on anybody because I think the gospel says it's a call to dialogue, and we can convince each other with dialogue. And that is what the Westerners tended to mix. They missed that point to say, let us dialogue. I hear you with your African spirituality. Where does this fit in? And then with dialogue, maybe I'll get converted by your arguments, and maybe I will not. But the gospel gave a platform. And we know this with the book of Acts, chapter 17, where Paul speaks with these religious men of Athens. He dialogues. That is the demand of the gospel. But when the gospel is coerced, in order for it to reach ultimate ends, then it's no longer the gospel, it's something else.
I think it's very true. If the missionaries got a hold of the philosophy of Ubuntu, so much would have changed within them and their approach to the gospel, to say that actually I am because you are, we're one community, we're all made in the image of Christ. And so really, if they came with a mentality to learn, and not just only to teach, like you're saying, but really, to say that you can't completely dismiss, and say everything is wrong, let me teach you, what's right. I don't know if Chris has a question that he wants to ask.
All right. Yeah, and truly getting in on the liberation movement that played role within our freedom that we have today. And I think most of our people, they just lack I guess we can get the attitude or the character to go out there and research and so on. But today we have the good men of God who will provide such for us, And I think for those who are really asking, okay, through the liberation movement, how did the church play a pivotal role within the liberation movement? What are one of those instances that we can say that was the church, and that was the church, where really people can point and hold the confidence that to say that within the freedom, the democracy, and the liberation that we have today, this is because the church has done what could be those pivotal points or instances where truly the church played a pivotal role in the liberation movement?
Okay, it's quite intense, but I'll try and limit it to a specific period moving forward. Most of the so-called liberation movements, strange that all of them were formed by deeply religious people. We're Christians. I think let's start from that premise. Secondly, I think Msuku Peko puts it very nicely. He says, it is common cause and common knowledge that when people say Africa for the Africans, they always make the assumption that that was a Pan-Africanist framework, when in fact it began in the church. Africa for Africans, African for humanity,
Yeah.
and humanity for God. So already you have,
Mm-hmm.
at least on an ideological basis, that you have a particular church that does certain things. Let's speak for an example. I know maybe we might not all agree about them. The
Yeah.
AIC, the African Independent Churches. You have a sense where there's not really a clash of the African personality, but it's the gospel saying, I want to embody a context in which I am in. I'm not in Europe, I'm in Africa. And I do
Yeah.
find the relevance of the African personality and the Christian God working together. So you have those few things. You have the likes of Abu Sobuke, when Sobuke makes that prayer to say, I mean, God, take me where I cannot go further,
Mm.
please you take through. And you do have a sense of that. So, but that's a little bit sketchy to a certain extent. But what is more important is that if you think in the 1960s, we had an organization that was known as the University Christian Movement. And it was around
Sure.
about that time where liberation theology was beginning to boom. In fact, it has always been credited that had it not been for the University Christian movement, the Black consciousness movement would have not been what it was, because it was the University
Mm.
Christian movement that gave the
Yeah.
platform to say, let's do this. They expose them to
Mm-hmm.
specific texts, particular
Yes.
readings, a view that is different hermeneutically and otherwise. Similar
Mm-hmm.
to that, you had a younger group of students also that was the student Christian movement, which will also
Mm.
come there, CSC Mashinini comes there. So you had a vibrant, very strong Christian
Sure.
orientation that was there, that understood that something had to be done. In fact, there's a document I think that was produced in 1976, the Cairo Declaration. I forgot what the synod, what you call it, the term actually means in full. But unlike the Kairos document of the 1984, 1985, the Cairo Declaration was much more stronger. It used the biblical text as the base to condemn apartheid. And a very interesting thing, what happened is that the student Christian movement had a composition of both whites and black. And you had a situation where even their white counterparts, they agreed. They said, comrades, you are telling the truth. This is what the gospel demands of us. But even more importantly, you then had your liberation theology, which came in particular from that university Christian movement, deeply to be articulated in this country by none other but the Black consciousness movement. You had the likes of Sabelon Dwasa, you had Abu Itumeleng Musala, you had Abu Takazo Mufukeng, your Alan Pusak, and so forth. So at times they were trying to wake the church out of its sleep. Um, yes, there was resistance because we've never heard a minister like this. I'm from a meeting with two church guys, and they're like, Muruti, we hear you, but we don't hear you. We can't. And I try as, okay, look at this biblical. No, Shulani is corrupting us. I'm like, okay, fine. Let me leave you guys. But you had a sense of, uh, when BC articulated Black theology, Biko made something quite interesting in his analysis that, God is not in the habit of going up and down from heaven to earth to solve problems that have been created by other human beings. Therefore, for us, for instance, you've got great ideas, which Cohn has also rejected, of the question of theodicy. Why does a good God allow so much suffering? But you have to ask, whose hand have you seen being responsible for suffering? Have you seen God's hand, or you have seen a particular group of people being responsible for it? And if you are, then of course you will not relegate what you ought to be doing to God, as opposed to engaging those that you must engage. And Abobiko and them, they try to make us understand these things. And I think the church responded quite well to those things, because they knew that, well, it's not something that they've been taught by the missionaries, it's new. But quickly, I think what happened then, the ball quickly changed when, of course, this was seen much more dangerous. It's not really good Christianity. Christianity is to allow suffering. Christianity is to wait for heaven. Christianity is to do this and this and this. And you then had your contextual theology that came and pushed our liberation theology into the fringes. You had a range of things, but this Christian faith, this analysis has always been with us across the board. We've always used the basis of the text, at least for us who are Christians, to engage in the struggle for liberation. So it's unfortunate that people are not informed, because again, there is a very danger of romanticizing African culture, which is very problematic as well. I'm not saying we shouldn't be proud of it. We should be proud of African culture. We should love it, but we must be careful of those that are no different than a pimp or a punk who's a preacher who coerces the masses and robs the masses. Don't think that you will only find them in Christianity and not anywhere else. And some of the reasons we also accept Christianity is that one of the things that it does, which other systems have managed not to do, it takes seriously the fallenness of the human condition. Sometimes we take for granted. In a society where women are raped in the way that there's something wrong about our humanity. In a society where things can be justified even if they are wrong, expresses that fallenness about our humanity. And it's for that reason that I think our ancestors were willing also to engage. They struggled with it. They disagreed at times with it. But now and again, where they see, I was making an example earlier on. I said, look, I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing that we promote Christianity in terms of morality, let's say, in marriage. And I said, but if you look at it, there's no contrast between the kind of morality that is expected in Christianity and some of the cultural values that we have. The only problem is that people made us with this is born in two different ways, when in fact they do fit into each other. When a young girl is at a certain age, there are certain things that were done for that young girl up until she gets to a point of marriage. So there wasn't really a serious clash. The problem is how this has been presented and what then has been used as the moral justification for certain things not to go on. You know, we never had the problems that we have even today when we claim to be a Christian society, because our values worked very different in terms of organizing society and humanity. In the same vein, and this I teach to my first years, I said, look, we've heard of this, that the first 10 commandments, the 4 refer to God, but the 6 have everything to do with human society. And I said, well, what is very strange is that for the Hebrews, unfortunately, you need to be told not to sleep with your brother's wife. The Africans knew that. I don't sleep with my brother's wife, generally, because I organize society in that way, So it's not that there was a fundamental contrast. It's just that the greatest danger is extremism, which is very dangerous in the terms of blinding us to see far beyond, and even to a point that we're not even able to see when things gel and work together. I mean, when Paul speaks to the Hebrews or to the Jews, he gives the criteria of the elders. He says, well, an elder must be a man who's married to one wife, which does not mean that they're unpolygamist in that fold, And here you have Christianity that came and said, no, you divorce all your wives, but that's not the demand that Paul made to his first early audience. So you see, when you begin to impose things that are not even doctrinal, and guys, I'm not saying you guys must be polygamist, please.
No.
What I'm saying is that there are things which Christianity was sensitive about. There are things that it would make us to develop very differently. But if we're not willing for ourselves, I struggled for a very long time in the church, because what I learned from the church was what the minister was saying. Up until when I was 16 or 17, and I read the Bible for myself, and I remember I wept, because I realized with this Jesus law I've been having a problem with. It's not this guy that I'm reading about in the Bible, but because I was oriented differently. And I always say there's a danger when interpretation precedes reading of the text. So many of us go into the Bible with interpretations already. So meaning that we're not sincere readers. We go there looking exactly for what I want. So it's a range of things, but I don't think it's a legitimate argument that is being made. I just think that people who are using the desperation of our people, who are using the pain of our people to try and advance certain things. But of course, the Christian church must always be on guard, and it must not be swayed so easily. We'll have to be patient with our people. We'll have to, some of us, I mean, I am myself guilty, and I always tell my students that if I'm a liberation theologian at the university, but I'm not a liberation preacher in the church, then there's something wrong. I'm being deceitful at some point.
Yeah. I think one last question for me. I don't know where you stand, Chris, but you've already touched on it, but I really want you to be a bit more precise. So I think the underlying question is, can I be Christian and African at the same time? And if yes, how does that play out? Like, I think there's, and I think you might have also seen this sort of, I guess this whole modernizing of things, makes us send our kids to English speaking schools, because if you send them to predominantly African speaking schools, maybe they're not so great. And so you're sort of forced now to adopt these Western cultures. But really, how do I live out, my Christian faith with an African expression within an African context? Like you're saying, like, how does the gospel find, a way to express itself within my Africanness, if you get what I'm trying to say?
No, I think I do get what you're saying, and it's a struggle because people just have a tendency of missing the point. Christianity or the Christian faith, or even let's move away from those words. Let's put the gospel. What is the gospel about? The gospel is about this fallen human nature. Now, I think many of us we might deceive ourselves and think we're very good people. The likelihood is that we are not, but on the main, you have a situation where what the Christian message was attempting to do is to explain that there is a way out beyond our fallenness and so forth. So it has nothing really to do with who you are in terms of culture, in terms of religion, in terms of this and this, because it's saying I'm taking seriously the human condition. Now, in the same way, I doubt African people used to go around parading themselves in the world and saying they're Africans. That's very strange. That is more of an attitude of the oppressor than it is of ours. Like that big joke that when the United States goes to the moon, they have to stick the flag in the moon because they can't help it. The colonialists, they have to sort of mark everything. But black people never did that. That's why we never had things like African philosophy. We taught philosophy. We never had African mathematics. We had mathematics because there's always a sense that knowledge is much broader and deeper than what we think. We have different cultures, but a common human experience. I mean, if you talk even with what we've abused for a very long time, which is that concept of Ubuntu, it has nothing to do with that we are unique. It's simply that we recognize our humanity and we recognize the humanity of others. And we recognize, I mean, if you think about African spirituality and religion as well, it's always contingent on nature, that I cannot harm the earth because I live of it. It's not really so much, what we want to make it out to be. It works for other people because it makes them relevant. But I think on the main, you can remain Christian and remain African because there are no contrasts between these two. They operate almost on the same wavelength, just simply using different methods. The one has to do with our fallenness, the other one has to do with our culture. But there's always synergies between the two. You can't act as if you can't do this. And I think that is what white people realized. They understood that we need to fashion this thing to express both, express our humanity as whites and express our culture at the same time. So I don't understand why we are failing to make the connection because our case is even much more valid than it is for them. So even when you talk about the issue of going to white schools and so forth, it's because we have abandoned the job that we're supposed to do. Fulani gets a PhD, he goes to university, he does not give a damn about the black community. He's not going to even come even at some point, and that is where BC was also important. So self-reliance. We understand our common plight, we understand our group politics, we understand that we are oppressed as a group. And this I always explain to people. I said, the reason why BC, and remember also that this blackness that Black consciousness was talking about was not what the enemy thought they were referring to. Black consciousness understood on the main that there were three classes in society, at least in the apartheid's logic. You had the whites at the top, you had the so-called Indian and colored in the middle, you had the so-called Bantu at the bottom. Now, do note that in those three categories, there's no black yet. Black is an invention by the Black consciousness movement in response to the fact that the group that is at the top wields the powers to give privileges to society. So they are the privilege givers. When they wish to give a privilege to the second group, they will do so. But the second group does not have the same power at any point in time because their position is always based on the will of the privilege givers. Then they came with the concept of blackness, which was a common plight. And when they explain in their policy, they say, we have defined ourselves as black based on the historical, the social tradition, and all these things which are part and parcel of our oppression. So the quest was to look for this common humanity, which already we shared together, except with those that were insisting that we're not. So we've always tried to make strides to affirm the humanity of others, to affirm our own humanity, and at the same time see no contrast or fundamental contradiction between, our spirituality, if we take Christianity or another form of spirituality. The problem is when we are made to always contend with extremes. So even our abandonment of the community. Shulani can be a good black theologian at the University of Pretoria, but if he cannot come and assist a falling church or perhaps a struggling church, a Kaelicha, Orlando, he's absolutely useless on the main. So we have to have the responsibility and understand that we have a common plight as African people, we have a common plight as black people, but we have a responsibility. And white society understands well, for every white graduate, for every white inventor and everything, it's an advancement of their race, whether they disagree. They never come to us and say, I'm French, I'm English, they come to us as white. But I'll come to you and say, I'm 100% Zulu, 100% Xhosa, 100%, because they need to maintain those divisions which are artificial for us. But if we look at us with our common cause and understanding that we've got a common bond of our humanity and we've got a collective responsibility to make sure we survive on earth, then I think we're going to do things fundamentally different than what we do now.
Sure.
Profound.
Yeah, there's some good stuff. Chris, anything from you? I think for me, you've answered all my questions.
No, definitely same here. No, all the questions are answered. And I even love the fact that he did raise up or mention the figures of the liberation movement that really were founded within the Christian movement. And I believe that as a Christian leader from now on, my confidence is just boosted to know that within the liberation that we have today was really prior to the influence of God within the heart of men, of the people who are looking like me, so that really gives me much confidence to run with that. And I'm glad to learn about this, but although I think for the viewers that are out there, those who are both Christians and non-Christians, and I think we going just through an identity crisis, most of the people, and all the easiest thing to do for us is to blame the colonial system, and then it's easy. And we, right now, there was a movement that is being done to say that we need to move back to our Africanism, just do away with the Christian concept to people that are listening to you. And by longer, they might be caught up between the concept of really having affliction with the Christian concept because of they might think it was brought by the white people and so on, but yet not being aware with the liberation that it was our African people using the same concept. I love what Mr. J. Matsubane says about this. He says that a religion that was sought to transform a worldview of an African mindset was also used to transform the worldview of an African, saying that this is an irony. It has benefited us in every way. But to those that are caught up and still not sure, my pastor, just to share to them, this is how you can go about it, and so that they might come out of this thing that is really conflicting and among their lives, to see the greater picture out of this, and see the greater good out of this. What lastly on myself, that is the last part, and what can you say to them to enlighten their path?
Well, I'd like to tell two stories, in fact, trying to work to that. And before I tell them, I think we should accept that culture, religion actually evolves. It's not always the same. So now, when I was growing up, grew up in a very Christian family. So my mom used to tell me and say, Msimelelo, when umakhulu passed away, she said to me, Mdanam, I leave you with nothing. except two things. Imfundo, when I pass over the other side, and Diva next, morning next. So my mom went with that, and we grew up with that, Kaya.
Yeah.
At some point, we then went, I think something was happening. Oh, yeah, the house would be flooded
Okay.
most of the time, Amanzi, every time. So my mom was like, okay, fine, I've never done this, but let me go. Gets there, the guy says to him, no, I was a and my mom's like, okay, fine, what is needed? And there's no, when it was Msebians, and all our cousins come all the way from Eastern Cape. We have the work, it gets done, and we do all those things. We do all those things. On the last day, so my mom goes to the guy who's been running the program. He says, so sure, everything's gonna work out. And then this guy says, yeah, well, that's cock. Everything is set up. So, okay, fine. We all go to sleep. In the morning, we wake up, the house is flooded. So it didn't work. And my mom then says, you know what? My mother was right. She told me what I guess what next, Akaboni next. But what essentially I'm trying to say is that African culture as well does not remain static for the rest of its life. It moves, and sometimes we might try to go back to things that don't necessarily work. One of the things I always ask my friends is to say, so our ancestors have brought us everything. They've brought us guys abakhulisa imizi, abaqinisa imizi, but none of them has brought a guy who fights for land. So I'm still going to wait for one ancestor who will say, my job is not to do anything. I'm not interested in any of the things you want to do. I've been sent here for land. So then the second story is of an old man, Bengsuka Jablani Mall. So I get into the taxi and he's driving. Along the way, he says, "Angeke." So I'm like, hey, Tama, ukhuluma nami?" I said, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to them. I say, "Wabobani?" Because the two of us in the taxi. He says, no, they first came and they wanted my daughter, who was studying at Vets at the time. I went and I got loans and I did this. She dropped out ubhizi usekhaya manje uhlola abantu ngama-R5. Now they've come around and they say, no, bafuna lo wes-2. They don't give a damn how I'm struggling. Bangifuna iy'nkomo, some of them bathengisile, banike vele amabhunu iy'nkomo, and then they come on the other side, but bafuna iy'nkomo. So that's not saying that I disrespect African culture, but I'm saying we must evaluate it, that people are going to use it to keep us moving around in circles. We're taking their chances because the world is full of chance takers. So we really have to ensure that we understand even our culture quite well and understand the nuances that it has. I mean, those stories, Zagabunsikan and so forth, they give us a view of a very broad metaphysical outlook into the world. But I think many are not willing to look through that hole because it makes them uncomfortable. And even so, they give white people too much credit.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking time to be with us here. And thank you to you, Chris, as well. I hope you are blessed. I was truly blessed and really encouraged in my faith. Yeah. And also just my value and identity affirmed as a Black person as well. So yeah, see you guys on the next video.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.